So welcome everyone who's here, and also welcome everyone who will be watching this recording from Westminster's YouTube channel after the fact. We are delighted to welcome John Reynolds this evening, who is going to update us on a program called Clean Slate. Sally and Sandy and I were in a group a couple of hours ago and letting people know that this program would take place tonight, and pointed out that at some intellectual level, most of us are aware that anyone who has any form of a criminal record is going to face obstacles in terms of employment or housing or public programs. And often these really prevent individuals from reestablishing themselves in the community and moving forward with their lives. And so Clean Slate is a program we understand that helps people in that circumstance, in that situation, find a way to overcome the obstacles that exist. And we know that this is part of a national endeavor, and that Delaware has been working hard to join that initiative. And we are delighted to have John Reynolds here this evening to describe Delaware's program, what it is, how it works, and how it helps people get indeed a fresh start to a new life. So, John, welcome.
Yeah, thank you all for having me here today. Again, I'm John Reynolds. I'm the Deputy Policy and Advocacy Director at the ACLU of Delaware, and I'm really excited to chat with you all tonight. I'll share my screen in 1 second, but let me first kind of lay out what to expect tonight. I'm going to spend a little bit of time before I can really talk about Clean Slate and what it does and what automatic record expungement does. I'm going to first spend a little bit of time just talking about records and some of the basic things that people should know and understand about them, about how they're used, how they impact people's lives, as well as some of the data about how useful they are at actually doing things like predicting people's likelihood to commit crime. Um, After I kind of go through that section, I'm going to talk a little bit about expungements specifically and how the different processes work in Delaware, and then move to talk about Clean Slate and how it builds upon the existing processes, and then the next steps that we still need to take to make sure that the system functions effectively and in the way it was intended. So I'm going to share screen right now. Just give me one moment. And there we go. All right, everyone, can you see the actual slide deck that doesn't include all the wonderful editing features on PowerPoint? All right, I saw a head nod or two, so I'm in good shape. So Clean Slate Delaware, let's get started. So I think as I talk about clean slates, I talk about expungements, it's really important to come back at the start point to some of like the underlying key terms to be able to understand both the issue as well as the legislation solutions that have been put forward. So as a start point, I want to talk about what a record is, because this is actually something that if you see it written, I'm sure you all have some understanding of what it means, but I will say one of the big things that we've had to do and realized over the past couple of years is that those understandings aren't all the same and don't necessarily sync with how Delaware defines and understands what is a record and what is contained on a record. So in Delaware, and generally, when we're talking about record clearance, this term includes both things that are convictions in which somebody either pled guilty or was found guilty of a misdemeanor, felony, or criminal violation. But it also includes all sorts of other things that never resulted in an actual plea of guilty or a conviction. So every arrest, every charge, even if they're dismissed, even if the person was arrested, taken to the police station, they realized there was a big mistake and it was all a misunderstanding, and they're let go, that arrest will still appear and be contained on that person's record. And with that, it will mean it will appear in any background check that is run. Now, different states handle juvenile records differently. Delaware, a juvenile record remains publicly available forever unless it is expunged. So when somebody, if they did something at the age of 16, when they turn 19, that record doesn't disappear. It doesn't disappear from public view. It doesn't disappear from like official view within more confidential systems. It's available, and it will continue to follow that person and appear on background checks when they seek employment, housing, or other opportunities, unless, again, it is expunged. And so, again, I know I've highlighted conviction here just because sometimes I realize when I say conviction in these instances, I get questions about, well, I pled guilty, but is that a conviction? And the answer in terms of talking about a record is yes. A conviction includes anything as a plea of guilty or being found guilty. Any time in which like the court and the case ends in that result in which guilty is attached to a charge, that is a conviction. Everything throughout this presentation I'll talk about as non-convictions are all of those other charges or arrests that are initiated but don't result in a conviction, either because the person, again, they're arrested but never actually charged. Oh, getting a little feedback from someone. Either they're arrested but never actually charged, or they are found not guilty, the charges are dismissed or dropped. Delaware loves Latin more than some other states, so we'll call it nolle prosequi at times. And the reason I think it's important to bring that up is in the context of a record too. I never learned Latin. I actually never encountered that term at any point in law school or while I spent a decade in New York. Only upon coming to Delaware, and I had all these people walking up to me about nolle pros or nolle prosequi charges that I have to go and say, well, that's not something I've ever learned. I have to go figure out what these are. And as you can imagine, if that appears on a background check for certain employers or landlords, when something appears on a official criminal background check and you don't know what that word means, it's generally seen as scary, not as like, oh, well, it doesn't say conviction, so it must be fine. And this is why it's really important to understand that record clearance isn't just about convictions, isn't just about people returning after incarceration, but anybody who has interactions with the legal system, because it can, while not necessarily to the same degree all the time, but it still can have very significant limitations on the types of opportunities that people pursue. So next two key terms we're going to talk about in tandem: pardon and expungement. Delaware has pardons. They also have expungements. They're two different processes that do two different things. A pardon is all about the state formally forgiving an individual with a pardon and restoring any civil rights that were taken from them as a result of that conviction. So after a pardon is received, again, rights are restored, but the record still exists. So if somebody had a background check run, it would say whatever the conviction was, and it would say pardoned, but it would still appear. It doesn't disappear after a pardon. An expungement, on the other hand, is all about who can see a record. All right. And in Delaware's case, it's probably best to think of it almost as a ceiling of who can see the record, not necessarily a complete destruction of it, so it disappears altogether, but it limits the public availability of that record for your standard background checks that are used in the vast majority of instances. There are still moments in which certain types of specific employment a record that has been expunged will still be available for very specified purposes. or certain interactions with the federal government, an expunged record may still be relevant and need to be discussed and revealed. But otherwise, an expungement makes it so an individual has the legal right to say that they were not convicted or were not arrested and that that record doesn't exist. They can speak and share information as if that was the case and is true. And will also make it so it's not available. And then this brings me all to the second chance gap. And this is the core of what Clean Slate as a campaign and the Clean Slate legislative policies are trying to solve. The second chance gap is the difference between the number of people that are eligible for an expungement and the number of people that are actually receiving one. So in Delaware, as I'll get to, for one specific type of expungement, there's estimated that 290,000 plus people were eligible for that one form of expungement, not the only form, but that one form. And in the year 2020 into 2021, there were just over 1,000 people that actually petitioned, didn't necessarily receive, but petitioned to receive one. So as you can see, that's a pretty significant gap between 290,000 who are eligible to receive one of a very specific type and just over 1,000 applying for any type of record clearance in Delaware. And Clean Slate is identifying the fact that the main reasons for this is that it's about awareness of this quite lengthy word called expungement that is confusing. It's not part of everyday vocabulary. And it's also about access to resources to be able to pay for the different fees or assistance that at times can cost money to navigate along the way. And it's also about time to be able to navigate all these processes. So again, knowledge, money, time are all three core things that block people from accessing record clearance. And that's what Clean Slate is trying to solve. So a few other quick things about records to put this all in context. Nationally, 1 in 3 Americans have some form of a record, either conviction or non-conviction. This is not an uncommon American experience to have a record. We arrest a lot of people, we incarcerate a lot of people. I'm guessing that's not news to this group, that we do so disproportionate to basically every other country on the globe. And because of that, we also disproportionately saddle Americans with records. In Delaware in particular, it's I'll say the science here, the science is imperfect in terms of the statistical analysis so far, but it's estimated that anywhere from 250,000, well, actually, no, it's more than 250,000, but originally they did this before the state generated their estimates. 250,000 to 400,000 Delawareans live with a record, which is obviously like 4 in 10, right? 2 in 5, if we like to reduce our fractions. And that means that almost everybody, whether they recognize it or not, knows people, interacts with people every day in their families, in their friend groups, in their workplaces, in their communities who have a record. And those records, while not a barrier for all and not a barrier in all instances, can often crop up in employment, housing, education, banking, credit, those contexts, because 9 out of 10 employers run a background check. 4 out of 5 landlords run a background check. 3 out of 5 colleges and universities use records or background checks in some context when making decisions, either around applications or financial aid or both, housing on campus. These things end up impacting the opportunities that people have, not because of who they are today, because of a piece of paper from their past. So let me now come to Delaware and kind of how we got to where we are today. So in Delaware, expungements had existed prior to 2019, but they were very limited in who could seek them and how that process would work. In 2019, Senator Brown had introduced a piece of legislation to update and expand the expungement pathways available in Delaware. And as a result of that, three expungement pathways were created. One is called a mandatory expungement, which has the most strict eligibility requirements, but also is, as the name indicates, it's if somebody is eligible for it and they submit the necessary petition, it's mandatory they receive it. It's not a question, there's not a weighing. It's been decided that these specific conviction types and records, if they meet the eligibility criteria, they submit the paperwork, they do everything they need to do, it's mandatory they receive one. The second pathway is called a discretionary expungement. This applies to a large, like eligibility for this is slightly broader, but as the name indicates, again, this is no longer a mandatory thing if you're eligible. It is discretionary. It's a court-based process in which judges assess petitions, in which the Attorney General's office has a chance to weigh in if they so choose to, and it is weighed whether or not the continuing existence of a record is the legal standard, is a manifest injustice to that individual. So that's pathway number 2. And pathway number 3 was allowing people to, after a pardon, go through the discretionary expungement process. So that would mean that there are certain record types that couldn't apply directly for an expungement. They needed to go through a pardon process first. If the pardon board and the governor decide to grant them a pardon, that individual may then apply for a discretionary expungement. And again, despite other branches of government deciding the pardon should be issued, the courts would still have to hold it up to that manifest injustice standard and decide whether after a pardon that record should also be sealed. So I just want to talk about those three because I'm going to be focusing most of the rest of my talk on mandatory expungements because that's where Clean Slate is focused, and I'll talk about why in a second. But I think it's important to understand that these multiple pathways exist, and it's at times they're not necessarily easy to parse through, but there are resources for either any of you, any of your loved ones, or other people that you interact with who you want to make sure you're sharing information with about expungements that's accurate and true. And I'll make sure that this gets shared with you all at the end of the program, but the Office of Defense Services runs what they call their second chance screening tool to help people understand which of these three pathways they may be eligible for, and then which resources and service providers are best positioned to help with each pathway. And that screening tool is available at ods.delaware, spelled all the way out, .gov/expungements. And so if you ever have questions or you have somebody that has come to you, has been seeking information about expungements, I think it's the number one tool I refer people to if they're seeking information about their own record and what their process would look like, because Delaware holds records very tight to the vest. Other states make it a little bit easier for people to gain information about what their own record is, which they can then use that access to go to attorneys of any kind or service providers of any kind to then get advice about what their eligibility is. However, in Delaware, only a limited number of state agencies actually have access to the database that contains the information necessary to determine somebody's eligibility. And the Office Defense Services is one of them. And they now have a unit set up to help people understand their eligibility and then get attached either to Office Defense Services resources or other organizations to navigate that process. So I just wanted to share that with you all. And again, I will make sure that the website, I type it up and share it with everybody, because again, that's the best place to refer folks who have questions about their own record. So now back to expungements in Delaware. So after 2019, we made these pretty significant changes that were quite important, but they were still relying on a petition-based system. which, as I already shared with you, even after this law was passed in 2020 to 2021, we had just over 1,000 people. In 2021 to 2022, we made huge strides, right? We increased more than 100% to 2,000 people out of 290,000 eligible. And I think it's pretty great that we increased that number by 100%. But as you can still see, we would have to increase it 100% for a bunch more years in order to ever get close to closing that gap. So Clean Slate was really, this is part of a national movement. There's something called the Clean Slate Initiative. Cleanslateinitiative.org is their website. They have been, they kind of in coordination with them, we launched a campaign in Delaware to try and target that gap. Again, to target this fact that knowledge of the legal system and expungement system, specifically money and time, is the sole reason that deters too many people from accessing expungement. And oftentimes those are the people who would most benefit from expungement, because the people with resources, with time, with money, are more likely to be able to access the folks with knowledge, or the systems with knowledge to help them through that process. But the people who are in desperate need of better jobs, more secure housing, and all of those things are the exact people who are disproportionately more likely to be blocked from accessing the expungement process. So clean slate bills are all about making this process automatic and automated, so that when people do the hard work of becoming eligible for a process, that state, who has all the information necessary to determine their eligibility and to process the expungement, does so without requiring the individual to do what Delaware currently requires: take time off of work to go get their fingerprints run at a set designated time at one of a limited number of locations in the state. They have to pay $72 for every time they get fingerprinted. They then have to go home, wait for their official copy of the record, and then submit their petition or application within a set time frame, depending on the process, and provide another fee on top of it. And again, money is tight for many people who desperately need expungements. And so this idea of having to pay an additional $147 every time they have to try and navigate this process is oftentimes a barrier, especially when it's time limited. And that could really stretch their budget for the period in which they have to do it. So Clean Slate in 2021 set up around that. Senator Brown introduced two bills, one that expanded eligibility for the mandatory expungement process, and a second bill that made the mandatory expungement process have an automatic and automated process starting in August of 2024. So here we are, September 2024, August 2024 has happened. What I can tell you right now is the Clean Slate expungement process has begun. I cannot tell you, unfortunately, much more than that. And that's part of what we're going to get into in a second. Clean Slate, the state has, been interpreting what exactly it means to make this mandatory process automatic. People can still petition for it, so they don't have to wait for the state to get to their record automatically. And I would encourage them not to wait, because the state has decided that this process is automated to a very limited extent. And I will actually go into how a clean slate process works. Clean slate process works by identifying eligible records, right? They had already indicated they could do this in 2021 when they were attaching a fiscal note to a bill. And I apologize for using all sorts of technical legislative language, but basically a fiscal note, for folks who are unfamiliar, is how much is this process going to cost to actually realize once the bill is passed. So they attached a fiscal note, and in that fiscal note, they identified that they could say there are 290,000 plus individuals who would qualify for this automatic process. And then they set a dollar amount on what it would take them to hire staff, develop any infrastructure and things like that to meet the needs of that automatic process. So step one, identifying those 290,000 plus individuals with their eligible records. Step two, having the state database, it's called DELGIS in Delaware, process those eligible records into batches to then share them with state police, which takes us to step 3. After step 2 happens, it arrives at state police. State police is the agency that's responsible for actually expunging the record. And they have multiple requirements under statute of things they must do. They've also interpreted that they must do other things as well through their own kind of decisions about how this process should work. And I'll come back to that in a second. But after they have expunged, they've identified, they've received the batch, they've gone through, they've gone through the process of expunging and sealing the record from public view. We then get to step 4. And this is where ideally a clean slate process will have some way for an individual to learn whether their record has been cleared through the automatic process. Delaware right now, the only way that somebody could learn whether or not they have a record that was cleared is they A, need to know they had a record in the first place, and then B, need to go pay $72 to get their fingerprints run at state police to then get an official copy back that shows that there is no record present. So it's this kind of absence of evidence, hopefully will prove evidence of absence or expungement in this case. But we know that that's not how that idiom works. So that's not ideally, it's not an ideal system, but it's what we have right now. So in Delaware, the big sticking point is really step number 3. We can identify the eligible records. They've developed algorithms to do so. They spent 3 years doing that. And the databases can do that. The database can then generate the batches of whatever size state police is able to process. Sticking point is when it gets to step 3. Right now, our state police are to my understanding, I've sent my understanding to them to ask them to tell me when I'm wrong, and they haven't corrected me yet. So I'm going to keep going with it because I gave them 60 days and multiple emails. The way that they're approaching this is after they receive the batches of records that algorithmically have been identified by the database, they then go back into the database for each individual record to confirm its eligibility. So a person then reviews each record one by one to confirm its eligibility before it is then cleared. They haven't shared how many records they've actually cleared in the first 30 days, but it's something we're going to keep pressing them to do because I think it's important for government transparency and also for just transparency around this process. Most other states, actually almost all of the states that have passed clean slate, for example, Pennsylvania, which was the first state to do so, cleared over 1 million records in a single day when they started their clean slate processes, because they built algorithms that would identify the records. The records, after they were identified, it's all in the database. So they made it so that a person just had to receive that batch, click the right button, and that record was then sealed. So it still existed in the system, but it would not be publicly released for individuals who were not law enforcement, the courts, prosecutors, etc. So Delaware has decided not to go that route. Michigan did a similar thing. They cleared multi-million records within a week. And we're now in this clean slate process working on trying to identify what has Delaware really done well, where are the areas that perhaps we're coming up short, because a law is only as successful as the impact it actually has. And if we're doing this on a record by record basis, it's going to take quite a long time to clear 290,000 individuals' records. I mean, I've heard anything from a year to 5 years from people who have different folks associated with state police over a course of a year throughout many different timetables. And so we'll see exactly where we are. And that's part of what I hope I can convince you all to join us in engaging whoever our next governor is and engaging the upcoming legislature to make sure that we're asking questions about where all this money was spent and this hard work over 3 years was done. What do we have to show for it? What are perhaps additional changes that need to be made in order so that these agencies can seal these records faster, right? If there's something standing in the way from a legislative or administrative point of view that's keeping state police or other agencies from being as efficient as possible, let's solve that problem. But a core part of that has to come, obviously, with people wanting to ask, how's it going? All that money and time we spent, what's the impact? And then making sure that we hold our state accountable, where if we're going to invest and commit to a process, that we actually finish it. Because we've patted ourselves on the back for being the fifth state to pass the clean slate legislation, which is really important. And I think it's like it is a moment to celebrate that this has started. But I think that celebration also has to be accompanied by a willingness to continue to engage to make sure we don't leave people behind. So the outline of this clean slate process, a lot more information about eligibility and the different kind of nitty gritty stuff attached to expungements is all available on the Clean Slate Delaware hub page, which is cleanslatede.org. And there are additional resources there, as well as that's where we post information about upcoming events or other things that people should know connected to expungements. And so I outlined the idea of the implementation challenges, right? Like the process as we exist right now, we need to get that right. But there's also at least three other things that we need to make sure that from a legislative and definitely an advocacy point of view, even if state police gets back and says, actually, you know what? We cleared 290,000 a lot faster than we thought we would. They were done October 15th. I would be ecstatic. And I would say, let's celebrate that. And then let's all group back together to do the three definite remaining things in order to kind of be able to say this process can be built upon, but it functions appropriately now. So the first thing, and I'm sure Lynn has shared with this group before, or maybe Mike, or maybe Bill, fines and fees. They are very, very commonly imposed in Delaware and have been historically. And thanks to advocacy of folks associated with the campaign to end debtors' prisons, it is slightly less than it was before. But I don't think anybody's saying that battle is not fully won yet, or that war is not fully won. The battle has been, at least for the initial changes. But fines and fees have a very specific impact on expungements. Fines and fees, they are basically a presumption against somebody's eligibility for an expungement. So if someone's eligible, but they have any outstanding fine or fee attached to the record that would be expunged, it kicks them out of this mandatory process. It kicks them out into something where a judge now needs to consider that question separately before they can actually begin their petition-based or application-based process for record clearance. So it's basically a hurdle that needs to be cleared before any other eligibility determinations can be made. And I just want to take a moment to highlight some of the kind of logical absurdity of this particular requirement. One of a significant barrier to many people accessing economic opportunity is a record. Somebody wants to get a job that either pays them better or a job at all, and their record's getting in the way of doing that. So they also have these outstanding fines or fees that are attached to some of the convictions on their record. Now, since they can't get a better job, or they can't find better housing, or, many of the things that could accompany this, they then can't pay the fine or fee that's attached to the record. So what do? They hear about an expungement, and they now go and say, okay, this will help my problems. Let me go try and receive an expungement. But oh no, they're told, we can't necessarily consider you for an expungement, or you have to navigate a more difficult, complicated, costly process in order to get your record cleared because of the outstanding fine or fee. So we have this circular loop of you can't pay the fine or fee, you can't get a job necessarily to pay that fine or fee, and you can't clear the record that prevents you from getting the job that would enable you to pay the fine or fee in the first place. So then you're all back to, okay, you still can't pay the fine or fee, and we start the process all over again. So I think that's a really important thing for us to address. We are kind of an outlier at this point. Of the 12 clean slate states that have passed bills, we're the only one remaining that still has fines and fees as a barrier. And I'm going to keep banging this drum until we do it. We've been banging it since 2021. And unfortunately, Delaware has made it a little bit more complicated for itself because we're now going to have to fix this and potentially come back and then tweak our automatic expungement system to make sure the algorithm works after fines and fees are removed. So remaining issue number 2, and this may not be very straightforward at first, but in Delaware, individuals do not have the ability to access their own expunged record. This actually is one of the most significant things that needs to be addressed because access, as you may remember at the very beginning of this presentation, I said, what is an expungement? It's about publicly sealing the record, but is still available for certain federal employment or other processes. One of those processes is immigration. The US Supreme Court held in a case that an expungement has no impact on somebody's requirement to provide a full accounting of their record when they're seeking to renew or change their immigration status or obtain immigration status. And unfortunately, if you don't provide information about those records, that can at times result in adverse consequences to whatever you're seeking, because you'll be seen as not providing the documentation necessary to renew your status, obtain status, or move from a permanent resident green card holder to a citizen. And it could actually work quickly in reverse, where if you can't provide that information, it could have very significant consequences for individuals. So it's something we need to change. Again, most other states explicitly provide this. Delaware doesn't provide an explicit ability to access, and the courts and state police are actually interpreting that it would be illegal and criminal for them to share information about an expunged record, even with the person whose record it was. So this is clearly something that we need to address legislatively, and we hope to in this next year. And the third thing is one that I hinted at earlier. I said step 4 ideally provides people with a way to learn about whether or not their record's been cleared. And right now, there's not really an accessible pathway for most people to learn whether their record has been expunged. And the only pathway that exists for a complete kind of accounting of a record costs a fair amount of money and is also, again, that evidence of absence idiom kicking into play, in which you can only find out that you don't have a record. You can't find out that perhaps you did have one and it was cleared, or you could find out that part of your record was expunged, but another part remains, but you wouldn't know that because if you didn't know what your record was in the first place, you won't know what was removed from it. So that's kind of the challenges that we have moving forward. So we've made really great strides. Other states have also, like Delaware is not unique in the fact that passing a law that ended up involving slightly more complicated things that needed to be done afterwards. I will say fines and fees, we knew that from the outset. We told everybody this needed to be done, but decisions were made politically to not include it. But these other pieces, some of them are just knowledge that's been built over the fact that this is now a national movement with multiple states implementing and navigating these challenges. But we have the ability to go back and fix it. Pennsylvania just passed their 3rd round of clean slate legislation, which they've been building on each time, fixing things that need to be fixed and growing after seeing, sky didn't fall, gaining more confidence in making this automatic process available to more people. Because again, folks with records, they are all around, right? They are 4 in 10 Delawareans, 1 in 3 Americans. And the other important thing to understand is that there's been a fair amount of social science research to show that people who are eligible for expungement after a conviction, and across the country, that is not an instantaneous thing. You're not released from incarceration and you're immediately eligible. There are waiting periods attached to how long you must remain crime-free before you become eligible. And people who meet those requirements are as unlikely to commit a crime as somebody who has never been convicted in the first place or doesn't have a record of any kind. So I think 3 to 5 years basically is when most of those time frames are. So if somebody remains out of trouble for 3 to 5 years, as unlikely to commit a crime as somebody who has never been arrested in their life. And I think it's important to ground that, because if we continually use a policy of judging people by their past actions and not recognizing, I know I'm speaking to a church group right now, not recognizing the concept of redemption that undergirds a lot of our legal system, undergirds a lot of our value systems as a country, as communities, as faith communities. This idea that people are not static, that we can change, that everybody makes mistakes, and that we must create pathways for people who have made a mistake to atone for it and find a pathway back to redemption, to be able to put their lives back together so we can recognize who they are today and not exclude them solely based on actions of their past that they have demonstrated they have moved past and moved on from. So I think, Sue, you said at first I was like 45 minutes. Talk slow, John, but apparently I just like talking. So we've hit that 45-minute mark. I want to create some space for you all to ask any questions you have. And again, I just have my email address up there, and for everybody out in YouTube land, as well as the Clean Slate Delaware Hub page. And I do want to flag that for anybody that you know in your life who may be interested in learning about their eligibility or seeking an expungement, the Wilmington Alliance is holding a expungement and job expo at the Hicks Anderson Community Center in West Center City in Wilmington, the afternoon, next Friday afternoon, September 20th. So definitely please feel free to share that information. I'd really love it if you do. The more people we can get to these places, the more, at least in the immediate term, we can bridge that knowledge, resources, and access gap, so that people who really need and want expungements right now can get some of the assistance to help them clear that record, while we continue to advocate for that automatic process to hopefully clear more of them without people having to take their Friday afternoons to come and hang out with me at the Hicks Anderson Center.
I muted myself so that the cat, no, I don't have a cat. Thank you, John, for that presentation. I learned a lot of things that I didn't know before. It seemed pretty straightforward. In fact, Lucy Peebles, Susan Badorf, and I'm thinking there might have been somebody else. Lucy, I don't know if you remember, after one of the earlier bills was passed, one of Senator Brown's bills, there was an expungement event off of Governor Prince Boulevard. And Lucy and Jane Palmer and I were there helping direct people. They had some attorneys who were available as resources to talk to people about the process, to talk about their specific circumstances and how they might be able to move forward. So we were sort of involved early on in that process, and it would appear that a lot has happened in the intervening years. I'm assuming that was pre-COVID, but
I think I believe that clinic happened in like January 2020.
2020,
And then,
just pre-COVID.
yeah,
Snuck it under the wire, right?
that was before my time, but I've seen the photos.
Okay, yeah, and there were hundreds of people there, and a tremendous amount of interest and enthusiasm. So let's see what questions people might have of what John described. Roger, you have your hand up.
I just wondered, there's seems to be quite a number of police departments, and I presume justices of the peace and little courts all over the state. Is it a barrier that they don't have records? Their records are poorly kept. They don't have the money to access records. Is that part of the issue?
So, Roger, that's a really great question. And I will say that in Delaware, it's been a much smaller issue than many other states. Um, our state operates on a unified court system where all of the courts are kind of under the same jurisdiction. They're all connected to some of the same databases. Now, that's not to say that all of the records were perfect and that nothing needed to be done, but the court was able to use the 3 years between passage in 2021 and the actual start of the automatic expungement process last month to go through, clean up some of those records, ensure consistency, and ensure that those records were being appropriately shared. So I can say that from a court-based perspective, that actually hasn't really held up this process. The policing part, the agency that handles records for the police, and again is the agency that executes expungements, is called the State Bureau of Identification. It's part of Delaware State Police, and they are also connected to the courts through that Delgis database. I apologize for getting like kind of data nerd slash expungement nerd, but Delaware is slightly unique, again, in that we're a small place. We only have one prosecutor's office. We only have one public defense office. We don't have district attorneys. We don't have public defenders in every different jurisdictions. And the same's kind of true with how we handle records through our police departments. Everything is centralized through the police. The courts are all centralized. And so all of those different centralized state databases feed into this independent, autonomous database called Delgis, which is the Delaware Legal, don't even ask. Delaware Justice Information System. There we go. I found it. That's what Delgis stands for. And all the other justice information systems, so like the court justice information system, the certain parts of DOC and the Department of Corrections and things like that, all feed in to Delgis. And so that's kind of our centralized point, which was fortunate for us. We were one of the first states to do that, so it's been around a while. The downside is that it's been around a while and hasn't changed too much. So it's still, if anybody has gone to one of our court terminals where you can access part of the CGIS database, you will likely be greeted with a black screen and that very retro blinking green or white cursor type setup
I guess so.
to take you back a few years. And so that has been a slight challenge, kind of the age of some of the technical infrastructure, but the ability to have everything synced together has not been, fortunately.
A little follow-up question. Landlords. Do landlords pay the same fee? And how? I mean, there's a lot of landlords. My son-in-law was a landlord.
Yeah.
Did he have the ability to check records? With paying a fee or without a fee, or which way does it work?
So most employers, landlords, other folks, they don't necessarily go to our state police and say, hey, I want John Reynolds information. I want his certified Delaware copy. There's certain times like state employers will have people go and do that. But generally they go through third-party background check companies, which adds a whole other layer that I didn't talk too much about. But they'll go to a third-party background check company who pulls records from across the country, right? And they'll say, hey, I want John Reynolds information. Here's the whatever fee that company charges, which is oftentimes far less than what the individual may be charged for the official copy from the state police. And that's how they access that information. I could go ask for one. You could go ask for one on me tomorrow if you wanted from these companies. You would still have a fee, but anybody can do it. There's no limitations on who can run it or who you can ask for. The way that third-party background check companies that we're still trying to figure out is some of them are much larger. They have slightly more, they care a little bit more about the accuracy of the records, including expungements, and different states make it easier or harder for them to make sure that record's updated, but not all of them do. And so not all of them update. And one of the challenges that can remain even after an expungement is making sure that the third-party background check companies accurately reflect it. And again, what's been seen and found is that generally the largest companies that the most people use do not continue to indefinitely share expunged records, but some of the smaller ones don't necessarily pay that same careful attention.
Yeah, that adds a whole nother layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Yeah, and that's when I go to my legal department and say, "Hey, you want to sue anybody? Okay, let's talk about it."
Well, I recall starting a few years ago looking for Bill Nace's phone number, and it said to me, "Do you want his criminal background check?" And I think I had to pay $5.95 to get it, and I decided that I didn't really want to know that about Bill. So, but there are all sorts of databases and access pieces. It's I don't know which ones are legitimate, which ones are not, but it struck me as kind of strange that anybody could ask for a criminal background check on somebody. Don't know how
Yeah.
accurate.
Well, and the one other thing I'll chime in, because in Delaware, one thing that we've done that certain other states haven't done is there's actually been a lawsuit about out-of-state records and how an out-of-state record impacts somebody's eligibility for clearing their record in Delaware. Because one of the requirements in Delaware is that you can't, sorry, the requirements for everybody, regardless of what the record is, you can't be currently incarcerated, you can't be on probation or parole, you can't have pending charges. Now, if you're trying to clear a conviction, you also can't have a prior or subsequent conviction to the case that you're seeking to clear, with limited exceptions. So, ours went all the way to our Supreme Court in the state, and it was determined that there's no actually accurate way for Delaware to check other states. There's no like agreements. The FBI database doesn't necessarily contain all state information, and it's not necessarily accurate. So it kind of goes what you're saying, Sue, is that, you know, even the people who are trying to do a good job, it's not necessarily easy to make all this stuff accurate, which again, in some ways speaks to why do we use records so vastly? Is it really necessary to? Because I would love if expungements weren't even actually necessary, because we had decided that they weren't, we limited how useful and recognized how limited they are in their usefulness and in making actual determinations about people. There are probably moments in which a record, you know, is relevant, but those moments are not universal. I wouldn't say it's 9 out of 10 employment opportunities. Generally, there's other information that can speak to that person's qualifications and
The expungements, I'm assuming that there are certain crimes that
Yes.
can't be expunged from your record. Is there a time limit? Does a certain amount of time have to have passed since something appeared on your record?
Thank you for that question. So for the mandatory expungement process, which is now also people will qualify for that automatic clean slate expungement. If it's a conviction, if it's a misdemeanor, not all misdemeanors are eligible, but many are, that they need to have remained out of trouble for at least 5 years. There are then a limited number of felonies in which an individual must have not been convicted of any other crimes for a period of 10 years after. So the waiting periods, you know, they exist. And as I shared earlier, like all the social science shares that 3 to 5 years without a conviction, that person is as unlikely as anyone else
Right.
to commit a crime. So it carries us through and beyond those time periods. For other types of expungements, it's generally there's actually some of them as short as 3 years, but again, it's discretionary at that point. So the person would have to be providing a fair amount of information to a judge, and that still only applies to violations and certain misdemeanors. And then felonies are all going to be 7 or 10 years from either the date of conviction or date of release, depending on the felony. And then there are certain felonies that even after a pardon are not eligible for an
Not
expungement.
eligible, right. That 290,000, one second, Sandy, that 290,000 number, is that the number of people who in Delaware who have a record?
No, that is the number of people who the state police and Delgis database said are eligible for the automatic clearance process.
So there would be
So
more people
that's a
than that have a
subset.
record.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
potentially up to 400,000. And the only thing I'll say about the 290 is that's folks who have a Delaware record. They estimated it was just over 200,000 Delawareans and another 90,000 individuals from out of state who have a record in Delaware.
So there are 10 of us on this call. So 2 of us have a record? 4 of us have a record?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, raise your hand if you have a record. Whoa, all right, Roger. Oh, Mike. All right, well then.
If you count traffic tickets.
Ah, Sally, there you go.
Oh, you do count traffic tickets?
So in certain background checks, a traffic ticket will show up, and I want to apologize. Traffic violations are one of the types of things, regardless of how minor or major, that cannot be expunged in Delaware. So that is something that, yeah.
Oh my gosh, I have a record.
Yeah. So, but yeah, and I think, and even if it's not folks on this call, I know I have multiple family members who have records, whether just because of arrests in which they were never convicted, or because, you know, many of them are quite old at this point, both the individuals and the record. But it's you know, it touches all of us, and again, it's a real part of the fact that we arrest so many people in this country.
Sandy, and then Susan.
So I have a question. Every time you apply for a job, you have the questions, have you ever been convicted of a crime or whatever it's reads. So if you had something that was expunged and you say, then you say no, because
You're legally allowed to.
You're allowed to.
Yeah.
I would have a hard time saying I never have been when I have been, even though it's been expunged. But I guess that's the whole point. You want to get the job, and so, and it's been cleared in a way, but.
And Sandy, I would reframe it slightly in the sense that it's giving the person the right to say no. It's not saying they have to. And so if somebody does feel like, in order for that employer to fully understand them, they can then choose to share. But the idea is that it's now giving that power back to the individual to control exactly, to be able to tell people who they are, to share who they are. Because, hey, there are certain types of employment where talking about the fact that you had significant challenges, you overcame those challenges, you returned home, you navigated all of these things, may actually be a meaningful part of the story you want to share with that individual. But at that point, it's that person's choice. It's no longer our government saying you no longer have the ability to actually tell others really who you are. We're going to have a piece of paper that many people are going to decide tells them everything they need to know about you. And so it's just shifting a little bit of how that process works, because these people have earned that opportunity for a second chance and to now have the ability to dictate how they tell their story.
Okay.
Thank you. Susan?
Well, I was a little interested, John, in, for instance, in our church, and we have a policy that there's a background check on everybody who is going to be doing any kind of interaction with our youth and children. And so you may have something, I was interested in something that I heard you say earlier on. You sometimes don't even know that you have a record until one of these background checks is accomplished, and that it might be for the simple reason of teaching Sunday school. And then you find out that oh my goodness, I can't teach Sunday school because I have this record I didn't even know I had. And so it's really an interesting, this has all been very interesting to me to listen to you tonight.
Yeah, and Susan, thanks for highlighting that, because I've unfortunately heard I've had some really, sad and hard conversations with people doing this work who the reason they want an expungement is they wanted to participate in their child's school field trip, and they signed up to be a chaperone, and they've never been convicted, but the school saw the arrest record and decided, we're not comfortable with you chaperoning because of what you've been charged with. And so now it's not just impacting that person, right? It's also impacting their child. It's impacting at times other people that, they need to care for. These records aren't limited to an individual. They can impact families. And when we over police certain communities, they can have adverse impacts on specific communities to a differing degree too. And so I think it's what you highlighted is true, is that we think, oh, they let us go. They said nothing was wrong, right? I don't even know I have a record until I go to try and do something. And then it's thrown right in people's faces. Can come up with stuff. I've had people who have tried to clear them because they want to get TSA pre-check or global entry, and a record from when they were 16 and they're now 56 is stopping them from being able to do stuff like that. And everybody has their own reasons. Some of them are employment, but I don't want to minimize the emotional ones that are oftentimes a really primary driver for people wanting to do this.
So what can we do, John?
So I think, what can you do? We're going to have a different environment in our legislature, and in the governor seat this next year, and lieutenant governor. And what I think people can do as we move to that is continue to try and make sure that we talk with people about records, and we ask candidates about whether they are committed to making sure second chances are accessible. So if you are going to any candidate forums, I know our primaries, especially in the Wilmington area, are kind of like our elections, but they should still be out. They should still be out there talking with voters a little bit, and asking their views on this, about this idea of second chances and what they will commit to. If you're interested in learning more about how some of the candidates have indicated where they stand in their commitment to helping to clear records, the votedelaware.org website, we created a survey that we sent out to all candidates for governor, lieutenant governor, and the General Assembly, and one question on each of those, tailored to the position that they're in, asks about records. So if you're interested in seeing where some of these candidates stand and what they've committed to, definitely check that out. And after we engage this, and we engage our community members to let them know about this availability and where the resources are if they need help, and we engage our leaders to hear what they're committing to as they're asking for our votes, when they are then in their seats in January, I will definitely make sure I let you all know the opportunities that we're going to be creating and the asks we're going to have for people to be reaching out to their legislators and reaching out to community leaders, to share their support for the idea of second chances and their support for some of the specific remedies related to the remaining issues that I've highlighted during my presentation.
Great, thank you. We try to stop at 8. We're 8:07, but I think Sally has a very quick question, right, Sally?
I do have a quick question. Is there any appetite for changing? It seems so unfair for somebody who wasn't even convicted, who was just released, no problem, for them to have a record. Is there any appetite for changing that?
So that's, I think, where the clean slate process is ideally going to be much faster. Once we clear the backlog, which is why I keep talking about this 209,000 person backlog. Once we clear that backlog, there will be a much shorter period between somebody having their case resolved, in which it is not a conviction, and that record then being publicly sealed. So, Sally, I think that's rather than having the absence of a record as a whole, because if you had certain folks from domestic violence advocacy communities and things like that, they would be here and say, those records shouldn't cease to exist. They do have meanings in certain contexts and can be important for other communities, where that they kind of continue to remain accessible for law enforcement as they then make decisions if they keep seeing the same types of charges come up over and over again. But the idea is that at least then we'll be limiting who can see them. And so, clear the backlog, and then it would be like a 30 to 60 day time frame between when that record resolves and when it's no longer publicly available.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, John, for being here. This has really been very educational, very helpful. We will follow up on the answers to the questionnaire, and we'll look forward to hearing from you when the legislature is back in session to make sure that we can help making our voices heard in support of this. So I appreciate your time. Appreciate all of you being here. Thanks so much. And let's see, next week, Roger has Dee Durham speaking on plastics in Delaware.
Plastics free Delaware and why we should clean up that I think single-use plastics are probably the largest issue. The plastics that we use for implants to fix your knee, maybe we're not too worried about that, but
Probably ought to keep those. Right.
keep those.
Right. All right. So we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again for being here.
Can I actually make a quick request of all of you?
Sure.
Just for my comms team. Would you all mind if I take a quick screenshot of all of us for the folks who are here tonight?
Not a bit. Everybody smile.
Yeah, give me one moment.
Oh, Maria and Craig. Yay.
Sorry, I'm now having to remember how to do this. There we go.
Uh-oh.
Command Shift
And
4.
snap.
Got it?
I hope so. If I
All
didn't,
right.
it's on me.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.